Welcome to this Ikon talk with artists Haroon Mirza and Jack Jelfs, Hoor Al Qasimi, President and Director of the Sharjah Art Foundation and President of the African Institute, and Jonathan Watkins, Ikon's Director. The focus of the event is Year Zero, Mirza's new audiovisual work that is available to watch on Ikon's YouTube channel until Sunday the 14th of February. Commissioned by Ikon with Art Fund support, Mirza's modular opera uses a sci-fi narrative to navigate a new global order. Part recital, part voice experiment, it is in part performed by vocalist Sarah Jane Lewis wearing a costume designed by Osman Youssefzadeh. Other elements are performed by Jelfs using self-built instruments and vocals by Alessandro Ravasio, a musician based in Bergamo, the Italian city most severely impacted by the first wave of the pandemic. I would like to take the opportunity to thank our guest speakers and our technician, Bridge Williams. We're recording the discussion, which will last about half an hour, including time for audience questions. So please use the Q&A function for this. To start, we have a 5-minute clip of Mirza's live performance at the Lahore Biennale, curated by Al Qasimi in January 2020. Staged at dusk in the landmark Gaddafi Stadium's Alhamra Amphitheatre during the Islamic call to prayer, Mirza's modular opera reflected the curator's ecological and cosmological concerns.
Well, that was an excerpt from the performance of Haroon at the Lahore Biennial. As James mentioned in his introduction, it was the biennial at the beginning of last year that Hoor curated. And to say thanks to James for the introduction, which incidentally was recorded. He's going to come back to us live in about half an hour, and he'll be directing a Q&A with those of you that are tuned in. But meanwhile, it'll be a fairly informal conversation between us, us four. But to kick it off, and in the light of what we've just seen, Hoor, I wondered if you could tell us a bit more about the proposition for your biennial. James referred to its ecological and cosmological dimension. But if you could say a little bit more about it, perhaps, and also how you saw Haroon's work fitting in to your scheme of things.
Thank you. Thanks, Jonathan. Well, first of all, I was really happy to be invited to curate the Lahore Biennial. It was an honor for me. As somebody who's lived in the UAE and the UK with a lot of people of South Asian background, people from Pakistan living in diaspora, I found that I was really interested to find out more about Pakistan and visit the place, and not only accept what I was hearing about the country on the news, for example. So when I went there, I found a lot of history, of course, in Lahore, and a lot of history looking at astrology and astronomy. But at the same time, I was also struck by the pollution that was happening and the environmental consequences that were happening around us. And there was this idea of how can I bring together the worlds that I know of, for example, artists living in the Middle East, living in the UK, other parts of the global South, into this conversation of what is happening in Lahore. And of course, I wanted to invite Haroon particularly to do a performance. I think we discussed the performance at the beginning on our first studio visit. And I was also in love with the amphitheatre that you see briefly on the clip. And it was trying to find the right project for the amphitheatre was not very easy, I have to say. It was a very magical performance that Haroon initiated and conceived for during the time to prayer, the call to prayer, the dusk time. I think that was really magical. So I think it all came around pretty quickly. It was a quick process, as you also imagined when you worked in Lahore, Jonathan. Things happened pretty last minute. So yeah, I hope that answered your question a bit.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And Haroon, I was going to ask you too about that context, because it occurs to me how much you respond to context, not necessarily to make site-specific work, but you're thinking very much about matching your work with where it occurs and what sort of audience you have. And to some extent, I thought this is quite an audacious thing to have done. During the call to prayer, a work that is entitled "A Belief Is Not the Truth," because the truth is unbelievable. Also, the sun setting. I mean, it was incredibly beautiful to be there. Incidentally, this is the last time we met in real space. I significantly remember. And in this stadium, which was it's a place for audiences, and in a very iconic piece of architecture. So, Haroon, could you say something about that, and what it was that that made that context particularly pertinent, poignant for you?
Yeah, sure. Firstly, yes, nice to be invited to do this today and talk about this piece, because we haven't really discussed it since it happened. And yeah, I think obviously the Pakistani context is really important to me. My family is from Lahore. My mother's house is still there that my uncle lives in, where she was, the house in which she was born. So there's an incredible sort of feeling of I don't know, responsibility almost, that there's, that I should somehow be more present in Lahore. And but at the same time, there's also you know, it's a very difficult country to be in for many reasons, and maybe more difficult as a Pakistani, you know, as diaspora in some ways. And I find it very stressful to be there. I mean, one of the major things is, I mean, I guess there's two things. It's the country and the physicality of the country, the pollution that Hoor mentioned, and, you know, the politics of the country. And then there's the sort of the dogma that is sort of really present in the country, either political or religious or other types of dogma and strange parallel realities that go on there. So it was a really sort of challenging thing to sort of address all these things somehow, you know, and work, you know, and the things that I was working on kind of sort of alluded to these things anyway. So, you know, I mean, Hoor presented this context, the stadium, the amphitheatre in Gaddafi Stadium, which I went, you know, many years ago. I visited that amphitheatre to watch Qawwali shows. So there was already this kind of sort of feeling of familiarity and music in that space, but also, you know, this point where the sun sets, the Maghrib call to prayer, which is the sunset call to prayer, happens exactly at sunset. So, you know, the audience was invited to come and hear the call to prayer because it's everywhere, and there's complete silence at that point. And as soon as the call to prayer finished, then this performance began. And yeah, it was challenging for me to make that work, and it was also challenging for me to present that work. And you know, these sort of political gestures, like, you know, this is pre-COVID, so, or, you know, COVID was just emerging, but, you know, nobody was really aware of it. But, you know, that mask was really about, you know, sort of about the pollution that's present in cities like Lahore, and you know, other cities in the region like Dhaka, for instance. I don't know, am I digressing? I'm maybe not.
Actually, that whole thing about breathing, I wanted to bring that up because, you know, in retrospect, it looks so prescient. I mean, there you are with the harmonium, and it's got this sort of rhythmic breathing sound, and you've got the gas mask on while you're playing, and then, you know what Sarah Jane is singing, she actually makes reference to a viral vortex. I mean, I don't think you had any idea, you know, of what was just about to hit us. Although I gather Hoor was saying that there's, you know, an idea that maybe already in Lahore in Pakistan there were some cases of C-19.
Yeah, I mean, I was there in December before, and I think that's when I first heard about the news, you know, of the virus, you know, emerging in Wuhan. However, the text was written a year before, you know. It was edited, so that line was already in the text. So, I mean, you know, I think without sounding, you know, strange, I think there was the idea of breathing was such a sort of universal, and not being able to breathe has been such, I mean, that was the kind of the omnipotent you know, thing of 2020, you know, the restriction of breathing. And somehow I think people were already alluding to this beforehand, you know, in some sort of collective unconscious. I mean, the conversations I've had with Hoor recently, you know, you also did a seminar about breathing, right, Hoor? And so I think there was something not necessarily related to the pandemic or George Floyd necessarily, but something that was, yeah, present there somehow.
Mm-mm. It is, it's a part of an ongoing modular opera that's a project of yours. I mean, it's an interesting one, this. We talked about it the other day, how you know, it doesn't stand alone as an opera. It's almost like a manifestation of something that's going on in a, well, I'm thinking of, you know, mushrooms occur in your work quite a lot. It's almost rhizomic, you know, the idea of the modular opera, and every now and then it manifests itself in a particular situation. And I understand the very first manifestation of the modular opera was in Australia. Then there is this situation in Lahore. Then I think you and Jack worked on another version or manifestation of the opera in London. Can you say a bit more about that, you know, the modular opera as an ongoing project?
Yeah, I think that sort of rhizome analogy is quite nice, because basically when it's performed as an opera, it's kind of like the fruiting body. It's like the mushroom itself, whereas there's many works, you know. I think at some point a few years ago, I came to the conclusion that all my works are part of a modular opera and they could be conjoined. So shows or presentations could happen where I could take several works, put them together, and it's presented as an operatic work with a changing narrative. And that's the kind of the idea. So, you know, a component in this modular opera could be an installation or a sculpture even. And then there might be obvious solid components such as singing in soprano, that really is quite explicit in the sort of reference to opera, I guess. So it's really about building narratives for me, and making presentations of disparate things in ways where it kind of somehow becomes coherent.
The other thing about opera, of course, it is a very collaborative art form. I mean, it's, you know, the idea of Gesamtkunstwerk, and, you know, so many different things going on, so many different art forms involved. I mean, there is Sarah Jane, as we mentioned. Osman was there, and I mean, what a wonderful coincidence that Osman Yousafzadeh should be in Lahore for a collateral project at the time.
Thanks to you.
Yeah, no, I think all part of a divine plan. And then Jack, of course, has collaborated with you. And Jack, the next question directed to you concerning the nature of collaboration. I mean, this is not the first time you've collaborated with Haroon. I mean, Year Zero, we actually see you on screen. There's the Cern piece that we're going to see shortly. Can you talk about how it is as a collaborator? I mean, of course, what an enormous pleasure it is to work with Haroon, but how you know, you develop a project together.
Well, I mean, yeah, I should mention that, you know, Haroon is a brilliant person to collaborate with, mostly because you know, he has a real lightness of touch about what he does and isn't at all precious. And I think, you know, when you collaborate with anyone, it's quite important that, you know, there's a lot of kind of flexibility and pliability about what you're doing, and Haroon is brilliant for that. I think the first sort of serious collaboration that we did was the Cern Residency in 2018, which has been an ongoing thing. You know, although the residency finished in February 2018, so 3 years ago, we've been continuing to work through what we started there. But the whole kind of decision to work together on that just came out of us having very in-depth conversations about things like physics and consciousness and mysticism that originally took the form of a kind of huge email thread that I think if you printed it out would probably be about kind of 10 meters long. And so really I think every time we've collaborated, it's always felt incredibly organic, and it's just come out of a kind of a friendship and a mutual kind of intellectual discourse that we have going on between us.
There is, I mean, there's this strong feeling that one gets that you're, metaphorically speaking, on the same wavelength. And what it was particularly nice to see somebody who, you know, is sort of involved in the development of the project actually appearing in the project as well. I mean, if you like, the process is embodied somewhat in the work itself. And moving on to Year Zero, I mean, the first thing we see, in fact, is you sitting outside your house, I think.
Yep. Yeah, I'm sat in the garden.
And you're tapping, rhythmically tapping on a metal bowl, and it's a handmade instrument. James made reference to this in the introduction. There are these objects that you make for music, a bit like David Toop, as we were saying the other day. And then there is this kind of idea of almost a kind of it's handmade, making do, kind, getting by kind of activity. But then it is conflated with very sophisticated digital technology, and that is something too, of course, that we see in Haroon's work. And I imagine that that's perhaps a kind of combination. You both felt strongly that drew you to each other.
I think so. Well, I mean, the instruments I'm playing in year zero, so I've got there's a tall kind of wooden thing that you can see that has guitar strings that vibrate with electromagnets. But that was actually built as a sculpture originally. It was supposed to just be a thing about kind of physicality and the kind of, the raw kind of unvarnished wood and these vibrating strings. And it was supposed to be something that just hung on a wall and made a kind of aggressive kind of noise, as a kind of almost like an anti kind of artwork, almost something to kind of repel people. But then it ended up actually sounding really musical, and quite often stuff I make ends up being musical as an accidental byproduct of what the original idea was. A bit like with the Wave Epoch, it was, it's turned into this album, but it was originally, something much more than just kind of music. And I mean, I should add that I started making art after I met Haroon. So I'd been involved in kind of music before, then I studied physics. But it was only when I met Haroon, it was almost like someone had given me permission to kind of actually do all this kind of other stuff. So I think, we have a lot of kind of connections in our practices.
It's interesting because similar story, I think, with Osman Yusufzadeh, who's now making sort of a name for himself as an artist as much as a fashion designer. I don't know that is absolutely attributable to you, Haroon, but it's interesting to see.
I don't think Jack's is either, because I mean both of them are, I think are kind of, art, what they do is art anyway. Making music or making clothes in the way Osman does, I wouldn't call it fashion. He has a relationship to garments which is both very practical and very artisanal. I don't know. So I wouldn't, and I think there's obviously a freedom in just making things for the fun of it, which is something else. But I wouldn't want to take, any credit for that way of working. I don't think that's a thing. Because I think everyone's born an artist in the end, because we draw and make things before we speak or write things down, but what I would say is that for with Jack and I, it was a very mutual exchange in that he became my physics teacher, more or less. I don't know if he knows it. Well, he does know it because
yeah.
I got interested in particle physics and partly because I became interested in doing this residency at Cern. So Jack went to Imperial College and did a master's in physics. So we kind of needed each other. We just sort of spoke to each other about things that we knew about, and it was a kind of a mutual learning process, which and the excretion of which was our work, the work that we started making.
Yeah.
So it's quite.
What's quite funny is that the way that our Cern collaboration kind of started was we'd actually gone to Imperial College to go mushroom hunting. Speaking of mushrooms, and we couldn't find any. So we went and sat in the V&A cafe, and I told Haroon about particle wave duality, which is this kind of key idea in quantum mechanics that a particle is also a wave. Assuming that Haroon knew about it, because it's so, his work is so related to kind of light and electricity and, flow of electrons. And really that was, I always think of that as being the point at which our collaboration properly started, this conversation that we had about kind of physics and consciousness and the connections between it.
Yeah, and the way that mushrooms keep on cropping up in your work, Haroon. I mean, as they did with the wall-based work that we showed at Ikon 2 or 3 years ago, and then of course in the Year Zero video. I mean, there's a bit of mushroom picking going on, and tree decoration, which is very touching. I have to say, the thing about the context within which you're working sort of crops up again with this particular project, Year Zero, because the context is, well, obviously where things take place. It could be, outside Jack's house, or it could be, Alessandro, who is singing, droning from his balcony, or it could be Sarah Jane in Carnaby Street. But the overall context is essentially virtual space. And it'd be interesting to know how you responded to that brief. It was a commission, an Ikon commission, I hasten to add, to make a work for online consumption. I mean, what difference did that make?
It didn't really make any difference to me in terms of, I mean, I knew that the piece was going to be online and it's going to be, so I just thought, well, I'm gonna make a single channel video rather than a multi-channel video. I mean, it's still kind of multi-channel because it's all these portrait iPhone, footage all sort of on layered on one screen. But I don't think I put that much thought into it, just because I'm so familiar with working with video anyway, that it didn't seem to be, I think the thing that was more important for me was that people listening to this predominantly in their own homes, on their phones or on their laptops or even on TV screens. There was two things actually. One was the context of YouTube and what YouTube is and how YouTube has functioned for many years, and its algorithms and what those algorithms have led to. It's a very long story. I mean, there's the podcast Rabbit Hole on the New York Times, which is very interesting in relation to this. But so there was that context, but also the idea that now the sonic element could be produced in a way that I think I spent more time on just as much time on the sonic element and treating it like a piece of music than I'd ever done before, other than with the wave epoch. So I think that was probably the more relevant point of departure in terms of actually being in the studio and making sounds to operate on that platform like that, not live in space, because before all my work is physical live sounds in space, whereas this is for on online. Everything is online. There's no live sounds.
And you often work with more than one screen, one thing going on at once. And in this case, you've got a triptych, which is an interesting, traditional format, and the kind of dualism that we were talking about before, in relation to Jack and the handmade, the homemade, and the electronic digital. There's a strong dualism also between the natural world and the built environment, and you use that triptych format in order to accentuate that. You have Alessandro on the one hand. I mean, that droning that he that he's singing is just so effective and wonderful as a sort of accompaniment to Sarah Jane. As I mentioned, she's in Carnaby Street, he's in Bergamo. Then she's singing outside your studio, I think. I was in conversation with Shazad.
And Osman, so Osman and Shazad's studio now, yeah.
Okay, yeah.
The whole Pakistani diaspora is in.
You were at home, but then you're in the center of this triptych. you have this sort of amazing dancing that's going on, and your daughter, I think maybe both of your daughters are there in the forest, and there's the collecting of the mushrooms. And I mean, there's a sort of strong reference to the natural world as opposed to, you know, how civilized we think we are. And in the lyrics of Year Zero, there is, in the middle of what is quite elliptical, again with references to breathing, references to singing, there's a line, the peak of excess in the guise of success. And it's a very strong statement that sort of sits there, almost kind of at a pivotal point. Do you want to say something about that?
Yeah, I guess, for me, we can't divorce that work from the pandemic. It was made in the context of pandemic while it's going on. It was, the fund itself was to kind of produce works during this difficult time. And yeah, for me, I mean, this is a very sort of ideological thing, which I don't really like to talk about really, because, I don't want to fix things in any sort of ideology. But it just seemed like this pandemic emerged at this kind of, where things couldn't get any more excessive, it was just, everyone seemed to be sort of run down and tired of just doing so much all the time. If you follow the way that the pandemic spread, I mean, this is Year Zero is a sci-fi. It's not based on this current coronavirus. It's just a pandemic. But anyway, it takes it as as inspiration, I guess. But the way that that COVID spread was, you just copy the flight paths, and that's the way that the virus spread, and that was sort of very evident from the start, and then planes just stopped flying, and then suddenly we're in this hi-fi world of nature. We were in the natural world again. It was a very incredible and powerful thing that really made me think, I guess. It had a really strong impact on me. I mean, the fact that literally, within a year, there's there's wolves in Italy now, the wolves have come back to Italy, and there's other, different types of animals have reoccupied spaces that they were sort of pushed out of. So there's something, I think there's something around that.
Yeah, it's interesting actually with the emphasis on London, obviously because you live there, but it is, one of the biggest hubs of air traffic in the world, and we've been hit particularly badly. It seems to me that Year Zero has because I don't want to put too fine a point on it, but there is a kind of countercultural connotation, and certainly in environmentalism. And when you describe the kind of activity that goes with globalization, sort of jetting all over the world, the virus followed the air routes. This, of course, then brings us back to an increasingly globalized art world. And I think, given the time that's occurring to me on my watch, probably my last question to Hoor, which relates to the way we are moving in the art world, and actually, again, speaking of prescient things, the biennial that we did together in Sharjah in 2007 was a very environmental show. In Lahore, it was very present too, and this last year, I mean, since that time, we have been communicating in virtual space. We've been very much on our own and introspective and profoundly reviewing, what it is that we do and the way that we do it. Do you want to say something about? You're managing a biennial in Sharjah, for example, as well as curating them, and I wondered what effect you think, not just on the production of art, but also on the way it is experienced, the difference that this year will have made?
Yeah, I mean, we've had a lot of these discussions in the International Biennial Association as well, where a lot of biennials are talking about what changes need to be made. But the one important thing is, for a long time, we've been saying that the biennial audience is mainly the local audience. It's not about creating an international public. That is a byproduct of biennials. Tourism is a byproduct of biennials, and that's what's been changing. So it's important to rethink your program in terms of local audience and local needs, and whatever comes after that is just, whoever can make it or can't make it. The thing that we've realized by taking some things online, because we don't want to take everything online, because the whole idea of art is that it brings people together. We need spaces to converse, to exchange ideas. So we've put a lot of information like talks and panels online, and it's created new audiences globally. But I think a lot of the biennials who do rely on tourism, like Venice or Documenta, those are the biennials that are struggling. I had a conversation yesterday with the director of the Sharjah Biennial, and they were talking about how it's really important to just continue the program and focus on the local audience, because it is what's needed, and it is the role of the biennial at the end of the day.
Okay, I think that's a good place to stop, and to say thank you very much to Hoor, Jack, and Haroon for what was for me a very stimulating conversation. And now there's a chance for those who've been listening in and watching us, for you to ask questions. James is going to be the master of ceremonies. He's going to direct the conversation from this point. So James, over to you.
Thanks, Jonathan. So there's quite a few questions. The first question is actually for Hoor again, and it's from an anonymous person. It says, can Hoor share some of her notes on breathing from the lecture Haroon mentioned?
Yeah, it wasn't actually a lecture. I was just mentioning about in the architecture triennial in Sharjah, the title was The Rights of Future Generations, and it was talking about climate change and the next generation. And for me, because of the time that I experienced in Lahore, every time I visited, I got the pollution really affected me, because I had bronchitis from pollution in Beijing and Delhi previously. So I was wearing the mask well ahead, about a couple of years now. And for me, I always thought about the next generation and the right to breathe. So that was really important to think about the right to breathe in terms of environmental pollution, but now also with the whole Black Lives Matter and George Floyd, I can't breathe. So this idea of breathing is just coming back in everything that we're doing.
Yeah, and like very relevant to the last year, I guess, with the pandemic. The next question is not a question, actually. It's just a comment from Sherry, and it says, you can see both Hoor and Haroon love their music. Then there's a question from Andrew, who says, I cannot stop taking my eyes off the disc behind Haroon and Jack, which is an interesting observation. It says, I'm guessing it's one of Haroon's record editions, and I wonder what these works are in light of the rest of Haroon's practice.
Those are actually the physical edition of the Wave Epoch. So the Wave Epoch is this album that we've just released, and it's a film that you'll see shortly. The physical release, we wanted to do something that wasn't just a vinyl record. So one of the instruments that we used to make the album was a record that was made by Haroon that looks a bit like that, and it's a perspex disc. I think Haroon's finding it. There you go. You need to turn your mic on, Haroon.
I wasn't saying anything.
Okay, sorry. Yes, perspex disc. And yeah, so the kind of physical manifestation of the album is looks like a 12-inch record. It's in a record sleeve with an inner sleeve with all the credits and the song titles, but with one of these discs, and the actual audio and the film are digital. So that's what it is.
Mm-hmm. And now there's a question about CERN from Ian. It says, as someone who's working with a particle physicist from CERN, but who hasn't visited the site yet, he wondered how influential actually visiting the facility had been for Jack and Haroon.
Should I go first, Haroon? Okay. I mean, I think for both of us, it's been incredibly influential. So when we went there, we didn't just want to focus on the science, basically. I've already got, I've studied physics up to a kind of master's degree. And for me, it's, you know, I think when you know something that well, it becomes artistically a bit uninteresting. You know, it's much kind of more fun to explore things that feel a bit mysterious and unknown. Maybe I'm, you know, well, I mean, what we really wanted to do at CERN was to put it into a much bigger kind of human context, you know, context of kind of general pattern finding and seeking meaning in the world. And so we ended up, well, I mean, one of the main things that we did there was interview physicists about consciousness and about the kind of role of like mathematics and language in shaping the world. And for me, at least, that's been incredibly kind of influential in shaping the way that I think about sort of reality, really, and consciousness in general. I've actually ended up in quite a kind of nihilistic place where I think that the human brain will never be able to kind of do what they're trying to do at CERN, which is find some kind of ultimate kind of true explanation for reality. I've kind of, yeah, I don't think the human brain is quite fit for purpose. But yeah, it's been incredibly influential.
And Haroon, did you have anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, I would just mirror what Jack's saying, but also, you know, definitely very influential, very meaningful being there. And meaningful is a funny word, because from being there, you kind of almost come to the conclusion that there is no meaning, you know. But at the same time, it's a very grounding experience, because you sort of really feel, yeah, it's like a real, like it's very, you know, there is like this solid attempt to explain reality, and it's very grounded and it's very empirical and straightforward and, you know, kind of factual and yeah, just yeah, but also very dry at the same time, you know, and yeah, this idea that there is no meaning, there's only patterns, and we're just seeking these patterns becomes very sort of prevalent. And yeah, it's hard to describe, you know, I'm not a physicist at all, so for me it was a very just an experience, like a sort of learning experience on one hand, but also just to explore something that's very alien to me. So it's hugely influential.
Okay, there's another question for Hoor, which says, you mentioned shifting the focus of biennials to local audiences and needs, but I'm wondering how you're thinking about working with international artists. How important is it to continue working with international artists, not just digitally, like Haroon Mirza's Year Zero project, but in real life?
Yeah, I think it's very important to work with artists internationally, because the whole idea is bringing people together. I think for me, it was important to have artists like Haroon and Shehzad coming to Pakistan and creating something that would be completely new to the audiences there as well. And I worked with a lot of young Pakistani artists who didn't usually get the chance to exhibit in the past biennials, for example. So I think the audiences there are many audiences that could be of different generations, different backgrounds. But in terms of bringing artists together, I think it's really important to align the conversations of what is happening globally through artists and have these conversations. And that was the point of this biennial, to show similarities. I did another project with Ajam Media Collective that continued as workshops for the biennial, and it spoke about the similarities between Urdu and Farsi and the connections between Iran and Pakistan. So I think these interactions and collaborations are really important, especially through artists.
Great. I think
say that the Shehzad that we keep mentioning is Shehzad Dawood. Just
Shehzad Dawood, yeah.
I think that's pretty much all we've got time for, so we need to go into the film. But I just wanted to thank all of you. I really enjoyed the talk, and thanks, Jonathan, so much for chairing. And thanks to the audience for their questions, and Bridge Williams, who's in the background pulling all the strings in a technical fashion. I will share a link to Year Zero, which you can watch until Sunday on Ikon's YouTube channel. And then just as we go into the film, Haroon, are you okay to say a few words as an introduction?
Yeah, sure. So I'll try and keep it quick because it's actually 3 years worth of like discussing that led to this. It's, you know, like Jack said earlier, we went to Cern with a very simple question, and that question was, what's the relationship between matter and consciousness? And a whole body of research came out of that conversation, you know, mainly consistent conversations with scientists. So what the Wave Epoch is it started off life as a performance, and we invited other people to Cern to join us and do things there. One of which is Gaika, a singer rapper, another one was Elijah, and a few others, so it started off as a performance. It then sort of became an installation, and then we thought it would end up as an album. So it's a sort of 35-minute length album, but there is also an accompanying video, which is an album length video. So it's something, it's really hard to describe or discern whether it's a film made for a piece of music, or it's a score for a film. You know, it's something kind of in between. It sort of happens simultaneously, and it's yeah. Jack, is there anything you want to say? Because
I think you and I were trying to define it the other day, and I think we said that this is the film of the album of the installation of the performance, which kind of sums it up.
Okay, thanks everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks everyone.